Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with an old rag as she walked across the naval airfield. The morning sun cast long shadows between the massive aircraft hangars, and the smell of jet fuel mixed with salt air from the nearby ocean. At 24, she had already spent 3 years working as an aircraft mechanic. But today felt different. Today, she would finally get her chance to prove she belonged in the cockpit, not just under the hood of an engine. The other mechanics barely looked up as she passed their workstations. To them, she was just another grease monkey, someone who fixed planes but could never fly them. They had made their opinions clear from her first day on the base. Women belonged in the maintenance bay, they said, not in the pilot's seat of a multi-million-dollar fighter jet. "Hey, Martinez," called out Tony Ricci, a heavy-set mechanic with 20 years of experience. "You sure you know which end of that wrench goes where?" His buddies laughed, the same tired joke they had been making for months. Sarah kept walking without responding. She had learned early that arguing with them only made things worse. Instead, she focused on her destination, Hangar 7, where her F-18 Super Hornet waited for the pre-flight inspection she had requested permission to conduct. The aircraft stood like a sleeping giant, its gray body gleaming under the hangar lights. Sarah had worked on dozens of these planes, knew every bolt and wire, every system and subsystem. She could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, and had saved the Navy thousands of dollars by catching issues other mechanics had missed. But none of that seemed to matter when it came to earning respect from her peers. Commander Jackson approached from his office, clipboard in hand. He was a fair man in his 50s, who had seen Sarah's work ethic firsthand. Unlike the other mechanics, he judged people by their abilities, not their gender. "Ready for your evaluation flight, Martinez?" he asked, his voice professional but encouraging. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her heart racing with excitement and nerves. "I've completed all the ground school requirements and passed every written exam." "I know you have." Jackson nodded. "Your scores were some of the highest I've seen. Just remember, flying is different from fixing. Up there, you cannot stop and think for 10 minutes about what might be wrong." 1. Sarah understood the weight of his words. She had been studying aviation for years, reading every manual she could find, watching instructional videos late into the night. Her small apartment was filled with flight simulation software and technical drawings. While other mechanics went home to watch television, she practiced emergency procedures and memorized aircraft specifications. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. 3 mechanics from her unit walked over, smirks on their faces. Behind them came Mike Stevens, the unit's most experienced pilot instructor. Stevens was known for his tough evaluations and had failed more than half the candidates who flew with him. Well, said Frank Morrison, another senior mechanic. "Look who thinks she can fly now. Martinez, you do realize that planes are not lawnmowers, right? They actually leave the ground." "Yeah," added Jimmy Walsh, the youngest of the group. "Maybe you should stick to changing oil. Flying requires actual skill." Stevens crossed his arms and looked Sarah up and down. "I have to admit, I am curious to see how this goes. I have never had a mechanic try to transition to pilot before. Usually, people know their limitations." Sarah felt her face grow hot, but she kept her voice steady. "I am ready for the evaluation, sir. I have logged over 200 hours in simulators and completed all required training." "Simulators," Frank laughed. "Those video games do not count, sweetheart. Real flying is about instinct, about feeling the aircraft respond to your commands. You cannot learn that from a computer screen." Commander Jackson stepped forward, his expression stern. "That is enough. Martinez has earned this opportunity through hard work and dedication. I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities." The mechanics exchanged glances but said nothing more. Stevens shrugged and walked toward the aircraft. "Come on then. Martinez, let us see what you have got." As Sarah followed Stevens to the plane, she could hear the mechanics whispering behind her. She caught fragments of their conversation. Waste of time. Dangerous. Going to embarrass herself. Each word stung, but she pushed the negativity aside. She had worked too hard to let their doubts affect her performance. The pre-flight inspection took 45 minutes. Sarah checked every system methodically, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over switches and gauges. Stevens watched silently, occasionally making notes on his clipboard. When she finished, he nodded grudgingly. "Your technical knowledge is solid," he admitted. "But flying is not a technical manual. It is about split-second decisions and trusting your instincts." They climbed into the aircraft, Sarah in the front seat, Stevens behind her as instructor. The cockpit felt familiar yet foreign. She had sat in simulator cockpits hundreds of times. But this was real. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she began the engine start sequence. "Tower. This is Navy 447 requesting clearance for training flight." She spoke into the radio, her voice clear and confident. "Navy 447, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 27. Wind is light and variable." As Sarah guided the aircraft toward the runway, she noticed a small crowd gathering near the control tower. Word had spread quickly about the female mechanic attempting to become a pilot. Some were there to support her, but many had come hoping to witness her failure. The engines roared to life as she increased throttle. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, faster and faster, until the moment she had dreamed of for years finally arrived. The nose lifted, the ground fell away, and they were airborne. For the first few minutes, everything went smoothly. Sarah executed basic maneuvers with precision, her movements controlled and deliberate. Stevens remained quiet, but she could sense his growing surprise at her competence. "Take her up to 15,000 feet, Stevens instructed. "Then, we will run through some emergency procedures." Sarah climbed steadily, the landscape shrinking below them. The view was breathtaking, but she forced herself to concentrate on flying. This was her one chance to prove herself, and she could not afford any mistakes. At altitude, Stevens began calling out emergency scenarios. Engine failure, hydraulic problems, electrical malfunctions. Each time, Sarah responded quickly and correctly. Her mechanical background serving her well, she understood these systems better than most pilots because she had repaired them countless times. "Not bad," Stevens said after an hour of drilling. "Your emergency responses are excellent. But let us see how you handle some real flying." He directed her through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers. Steep turns, high G pulls, precision approaches. With each exercise, Sarah's confidence grew. The aircraft felt like an extension of her body, responding to her every command with perfect precision. As they prepared to return to base, Stevens was unusually quiet. Sarah wondered if she had done something wrong, if her performance had been inadequate despite feeling so natural. "How do you think you did?" he asked finally. "I think I performed adequately, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "There is always room for improvement. But I felt comfortable with the aircraft." Stevens chuckled, the first positive sound she had heard from him. "Adequately? Martinez, in 15 years of instruction, I have rarely seen a first-time performance like that. Your situational awareness is exceptional, and your technical knowledge gives you an advantage most pilots never have." Sarah felt a surge of pride but kept her emotions in check. She still had to land the aircraft successfully, and she knew the mechanics would be waiting to criticize any imperfection in her performance. The approach to landing proved challenging. Crosswinds had picked up while they were airborne, and the runway required a precise angle to compensate. Sarah had practiced this scenario dozens of times in simulators, but real wind conditions were unpredictable. She lined up the aircraft, making small adjustments to maintain the correct glide path. The runway grew larger in her windscreen as they descended. At the last moment, a gust of wind pushed them slightly off course. Sarah reacted instinctively, applying rudder and adjusting power to compensate. The landing was smooth and professional. As they taxied back to the hangar, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and accomplishment. She had proven to herself that she could fly, but the real test would be convincing others. The mechanics were waiting when they shut down the engines. Their expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Frank Morrison stood with his arms crossed, clearly expecting to hear about her failures. Stevens climbed out of the aircraft first, his face unreadable. The small crowd of onlookers pressed closer, eager to hear his evaluation. "Well?" Commander Jackson asked. Stevens looked at Sarah, then at the assembled mechanics. "She needs more training," he said finally. "But she has potential." The mechanics exchanged knowing looks, interpreting his words as a polite way of saying she had failed. Frank nodded smugly, while Jimmy whispered something to Tony that made them both laugh. Sarah felt her heart sink. She had thought the flight went well, but apparently, Stevens had seen flaws she had missed. Maybe the mechanics were right. Maybe she was fooling herself about her abilities. As the crowd began to disperse, Stevens approached her quietly. "Do not let their attitudes get to you," he said in a low voice. "You flew better today than many pilots, with hundreds of hours of experience." "The potential I mentioned?" That was an understatement. Sarah looked at him in confusion. "Then why did you say I need more training?" Stevens smiled slightly. "Because you do. Every pilot does. But you have something special, Martinez. Natural instinct combined with technical knowledge. That is a rare combination." Despite Stevens' private encouragement, Sarah knew the mechanics had heard only what they wanted to hear. As she walked back to the maintenance bay, she could see the satisfaction in their faces. To them, her flight had been confirmation of their beliefs about women in aviation. The rest of the day passed slowly. Sarah worked on routine maintenance tasks while enduring constant comments from her colleagues. They had already decided she was not pilot material, and nothing she said would change their minds. But as she cleaned her tools at the end of the shift, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would continue training, would keep proving herself, no matter how long it took. The feeling of flying, of controlling such a powerful machine, had been everything she had dreamed it would be. She did not know that her performance had caught the attention of someone far more important than her fellow mechanics. Hidden among the crowd that day had been Rear Admiral Patricia Hayes, visiting the base on an inspection tour. The Admiral had watched Sarah's takeoff and landing with keen interest, and she had heard Stevens' real assessment of the young mechanic's abilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Sarah allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished. She had taken the first step toward her dream, and despite the negativity around her, she knew she belonged in the sky. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's first evaluation flight, and the mockery from her fellow mechanics had only intensified. Every morning brought fresh comments about her flying fantasies and suggestions that she should focus on her real job. The negativity was beginning to wear on her confidence, despite Commander Jackson's continued support for her pilot training. "Hey Martinez," Frank Morrison called out as she arrived for her shift. "I heard you took another flight yesterday. How many birds did you hit this time?" His cronies erupted in laughter, the same cruel humor they had subjected her to for weeks. Sarah bit back her response and headed to her workstation. The truth was, her second and third evaluation flights had gone even better than the first. Stevens had praised her progress privately, noting her exceptional ability to handle emergency situations and her smooth flying technique. But somehow, word on the base was that she was struggling, that her flights were barely passing marks. She suspected the mechanics were deliberately spreading false rumors, trying to undermine her reputation before it could be established. In the tight-knit military community, perception often mattered more than reality, and they were doing their best to paint her as incompetent. The work assignment board showed that Sarah had been given maintenance duty on 3 F-18 seconds that needed major engine overhauls. It was demanding work that would take most of the day. But she welcomed the distraction. When she was elbow-deep in an engine compartment, diagnosing complex mechanical problems, she felt confident and capable. As she began disassembling the first engine, Tony Ritchie approached with his usual smug expression. "Jackson wants to see you in his office," he said. "Probably to tell you this pilot thing is not working out." Sarah wiped her hands and walked to the commander's office, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe Stevens had filed a negative report. Maybe the base commanders had decided her training was too expensive or disruptive. She knocked on the door and entered when Jackson called out. "Sit down, Martinez," Jackson said, gesturing to a chair. His expression was serious, which did little to calm her nerves. "I wanted to discuss your training progress." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, bracing herself for disappointment. Jackson shuffled through some papers on his desk before looking up at her. "Stevens has been sending me detailed reports on your flights. According to him, you are progressing faster than any student he has worked with in years." Sarah felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by confusion. "Thank you, sir. But I have been hearing around the base that my performance has been questionable." Jackson's expression darkened. "That is exactly what I wanted to discuss. It seems some people have been spreading misinformation about your abilities. Stevens is furious about it. He says the rumors are not only false, but potentially dangerous to your career." "I see," Sarah said, though she was not entirely surprised. The mechanics had made their feelings clear from the beginning. "Here is what we are going to do," Jackson continued. "Next week, we are having a special demonstration for some visiting officials. Admiral Hayes will be touring the base, and we want to showcase our training programs. Stevens has recommended that you perform a demonstration flight as part of the presentation." Sarah's heart began to race. "A demonstration flight, sir?" "That is right. You will take off, perform a series of maneuvers, and land in front of the Admiral and her staff. It will be an opportunity to show what our training program can accomplish." Jackson leaned forward in his chair. "It will also be a chance for you to prove, once and for all, that the rumors about your abilities are completely false." The weight of the opportunity settled on Sarah's shoulders. This would be her chance to demonstrate her skills to the highest levels of command. But it would also be a very public test. If she made any mistakes, her aviation dreams would likely be over forever. "I understand the pressure this puts on you," Jackson said, reading her expression. "But Stevens believes you are ready. And so do I. The question is, do you feel ready?" Sarah thought about all the hours she had spent studying, all the simulator time, all the actual flights where she had felt the aircraft respond perfectly to her commands. Despite the constant negativity from the mechanics, she knew her abilities were solid. "Yes, sir," she said firmly. Jackson smiled for the first time since she had entered his office. "Good. The demonstration is scheduled for Thursday at 1400 hours. Stevens will brief you on the specific maneuvers they want to see." As Sarah left the commander's office, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. This was the opportunity she had been working toward, but it was also the biggest risk she had ever taken. If she succeeded, it might finally earn her the respect she deserved. If she failed, the mechanics would have all the ammunition they needed to end her aviation aspirations permanently. Word of the demonstration flight spread quickly through the base. By lunchtime, everyone knew that the female mechanic would be performing for the Admiral. The reactions were predictably mixed, with some people expressing support and others making it clear they expected a spectacular failure. The mechanics in her unit were particularly vocal in their skepticism. During their afternoon break, they gathered around her workstation with barely concealed glee. "A demonstration flight?" Frank Morrison laughed. "In front of the Admiral?" "Martinez, you are really setting yourself up for embarrassment now." "I heard Admiral Hayes has zero tolerance for wasted time," added Jimmy Walsh. "When you crash and burn out there, it will reflect poorly on this entire unit." Tony Ricci nodded sagely. "Maybe you should call in sick that day. Save yourself the humiliation, and save us from looking like fools for training someone who cannot handle the pressure." Sarah continued working on the engine in front of her, her hands steady despite the anger building inside her. "I appreciate your concern," she said, without looking up, "but I am confident in my abilities." "Confident?" Frank snorted. "Martinez, flying a fighter jet is not like fixing one. When you are up there making a fool of yourself, remember that we tried to warn you." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with each mechanic adding their own prediction of disaster. Sarah listened to it all, using their negativity as fuel for her determination. She would prove them wrong, not with words, but with actions. That evening, she stayed late on the base, reviewing flight manuals and studying the specific procedures she would need to demonstrate. Stevens had provided her with a detailed brief of what the Admiral would want to see, A clean takeoff, precision flying at various altitudes, emergency procedure demonstrations, and a flawless landing. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah flew practice runs with Stevens, refining her technique and building confidence. Each flight went smoothly, with Stevens offering fewer corrections and more praise as her skills sharpened. "You are as ready as anyone can be," he told her after their final practice session. "Just remember, flying is about confidence as much as skill. Trust your training and trust your instincts." On Thursday morning, Sarah arrived at the hangar early to conduct an exhaustive pre-flight inspection of the aircraft she would be flying. Every system had to be perfect, every component functioning flawlessly. She could not afford to have mechanical issues interrupt her demonstration. As the morning progressed, activity on the base increased significantly. Staff cars arrived carrying officials she did not recognize, and maintenance crews worked frantically to ensure everything was in perfect order for the Admiral's visit. At noon, word came that Admiral Hayes had arrived and was touring the maintenance facilities. Sarah caught glimpses of the entourage as it moved through the base. The Admiral herself, a formidable-looking woman in her 50s with short gray hair and an air of absolute authority. Commander Jackson appeared at Sarah's side as she completed her preparations. "The Admiral will be watching from the tower observation deck," he said. "She has been briefed on your background and is very interested in seeing what you can do." "Sec." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. At 1,330 hours, Sarah began her final preparations for the flight. She put on her flight suit, checked her helmet and oxygen connections, and reviewed her flight plan one more time. The mechanics from her unit watched from a distance, their expressions ranging from anticipation to barely concealed hope for failure. Stevens met her at the aircraft, his usual stern demeanor softened by what might have been pride. "This is your moment, Martinez," he said quietly. "Show them what you are made of." As Sarah climbed into the cockpit, she could see the observation deck of the control tower filled with officials. Admiral Hayes stood at the center of the group, binoculars in hand, clearly focused on the proceedings below. The engine start sequence proceeded flawlessly, each system coming online exactly as it should. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency across the controls, her mechanical background allowing her to detect any irregularities by sound alone. "Tower. This is Navy 447, requesting clearance for demonstration flight," she announced over the radio. "Navy 447, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 27. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited." As Sarah guided the aircraft toward the runway, she could see crowds of personnel gathered along the fence line and on nearby buildings. Word of the demonstration had spread throughout the base, and it seemed like everyone wanted to witness this unusual event. The takeoff roll was smooth and powerful, the aircraft responding instantly to her commands. As the nose lifted and they became airborne, Sarah felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with flying. Up here, with the controls in her hands and the sky around her, all the negativity and doubt seemed far away. The demonstration proceeded flawlessly. Sarah executed each maneuver with precision, her movements smooth and controlled. She performed steep turns, climbs, and descents with textbook accuracy. When Stevens called out emergency procedures over the radio, she responded instantly and correctly, her reactions honed by months of intensive training. From the observer's perspective, it was clear that this was not a struggling student but a natural pilot who had found her calling. The aircraft moved through the sky with grace and purpose, every movement deliberate and confident. As the demonstration neared its conclusion, Sarah prepared for the most critical part of the flight, the landing. She knew that many pilots who flew well at altitude struggled with the precise control required for a perfect touchdown, especially with such an important audience watching. The approach was textbook perfect, her speed and angle exactly on target. As the runway grew larger in her windscreen, Sarah felt completely in control, her confidence absolute. The touchdown was so smooth it was barely perceptible, followed by a straight rollout down the center line of the runway. As she taxied back toward the hangar, Sarah could see people on the ground pointing and gesturing. From their body language, she could tell the demonstration had gone well, but she would not know the full impact until she shut down the engines and faced the waiting crowd. The mechanics from her unit were among the first people she saw as she climbed out of the aircraft. Their expressions had changed dramatically from earlier in the day. The smugness and anticipated satisfaction had been replaced by something that looked like shock and, in some cases, grudging respect. Commander Jackson approached with a broad smile on his face, followed by Stevens, who looked genuinely proud. But it was the sight of Admiral Hayes descending from the tower, heading directly toward the aircraft, that made Sarah's heart race with anticipation. The next few minutes would determine not just her future as a pilot, but her entire career in the Navy. As the Admiral approached, Sarah straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever judgment awaited her. Admiral Patricia Hayes strode across the tarmac with the confidence of someone who had spent 30 years in naval aviation. Her staff followed at a respectful distance as she approached the aircraft where Sarah was completing her post-flight checks. The crowd of mechanics, pilots, and base personnel grew larger by the minute, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Sarah removed her helmet and climbed down from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady from the adrenaline that was still coursing through her system. The demonstration flight had felt perfect from her perspective, but she knew that the real test was about to begin. Admiral Hayes had a reputation for being direct and unforgiving when it came to aviation standards. "Petty Officer Martinez," the Admiral said as she approached, her voice carrying easily across the quiet hangar. "I am Admiral Hayes." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, standing at attention. "It is an honor to meet you, Admiral." Hayes nodded and walked around the aircraft, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who understood every component and system. She ran her hand along the wing surface, checked the landing gear, and even peered into the engine intake. The inspection was thorough and silent, leaving everyone wondering what she was thinking. "Tell me about your background," Hayes said finally, turning back to face Sarah. "I understand you started as a mechanic." "Yes, ma'am. I have been working on aircraft for 3 years, specializing in engine systems and avionics. I began flight training 6 months ago." "And why did you want to transition from maintenance to flying?" Sarah had prepared for this question, but standing in front of one of the Navy's most senior officers made her carefully rehearsed answer seem inadequate. Instead, she decided to speak from the heart. "Because I love aircraft, Admiral. I love understanding how they work, but I also love the idea of being the one to make them perform to their full potential. Working on engines taught me what these machines are capable of, and I wanted to be the one to unleash that capability." Hayes studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. From the corner of her eye, Sarah could see the mechanics from her unit watching intently, waiting to hear their assumptions about her abilities confirmed by the highest authority present. "Commander Jackson," Hayes called out without taking her eyes off Sarah. "What can you tell me about this young woman's mechanical abilities?" Jackson stepped forward, his posture formal but his voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. "Admiral, Petty Officer Martinez is one of the finest mechanics we have ever had on this base. She has diagnosed problems that stumped mechanics with 20 years of experience. Her understanding of aircraft systems is exceptional. And her flying abilities? Instructor Stevens can speak to that better than I can, ma'am." Hayes turned to Stevens, who had been standing quietly near the aircraft's nose. "Well, Instructor, I saw the flight myself, but I want your professional assessment." Stevens stepped forward, his usual stern expression replaced by something that might have been pride. "Admiral, in 15 years of flight instruction, I have rarely seen a student with such natural ability combined with technical knowledge. Her emergency responses are textbook perfect, her situational awareness is outstanding, and her aircraft control is precise and confident. How does she compare to other pilot candidates?" "There is no comparison, ma'am. Most students at her level of training would not have been ready for a demonstration flight like this. She performed maneuvers that I typically reserve for students with significantly more experience." A murmur went through the crowd at Stevens' assessment. The mechanics from Sarah's unit exchanged glances, their confident predictions of failure clearly proving incorrect. Admiral Hayes walked closer to Sarah, studying her with the intensity of someone who had made life-changing decisions about countless military personnel over the years. "Petty Officer Martinez, what you just demonstrated was impressive, but flying a single demonstration flight is different from the day-to-day reality of being a naval aviator. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied without hesitation. I understand the challenges and responsibilities that come with being a pilot. I have been preparing for this opportunity for years. Not just the past 6 months. Years? Yes, ma'am. I have been studying flight manuals, practicing on simulators, and learning everything I could about aviation since I first started working with aircraft. Being a mechanic was always a step toward becoming a pilot, not an end goal. Hayes nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. She smiled slightly. The first sign of approval she had shown since arriving at the aircraft. I started as a mechanic too, she said, her voice carrying a note of personal connection that surprised everyone present. 32 years ago, there were even fewer women in aviation than there are today. I faced skepticism, discrimination, and outright hostility from people who believed women had no place in military aircraft. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized where this conversation might be heading. But I also had supporters, Hayes continued. People who judged me by my abilities rather than their preconceptions. People who gave me opportunities to prove myself. She gestured toward the aircraft behind them. What I just watched was not the performance of a struggling student or someone in over her head. What I saw was a natural pilot who happens to have an exceptional understanding of the machines she flies. The Admiral turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. Her voice carried easily across the hangar, ensuring that everyone present could hear her words clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed represents the best of what our training programs can achieve. Petty Officer Martinez has demonstrated that dedication, hard work, and natural ability can overcome any obstacle, including the narrow-minded thinking that sometimes exists in our ranks. Frank Morrison, Tony Ricci, and Jimmy Walsh stood together near the back of the crowd, their faces showing a mixture of shock and discomfort. The confident mockery they had displayed for months had been replaced by an uncomfortable realization that they had badly misjudged their colleague. Commander Jackson, Hayes continued, I want Petty Officer Martinez fast-tracked through the remaining phases of flight training. Based on what I observed today, she should be flying operational missions within 6 months. Yes, ma'am, Jackson replied, unable to hide his satisfaction. I will personally oversee her training schedule. Hayes turned back to Sarah, her expression now openly approving. Petty Officer Martinez, you have just proven that excellence has no gender, no background limitations, and no restrictions except those we impose on ourselves. I expect great things from you. Thank you, Admiral, Sarah managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. I will not disappoint you or the Navy. I do not believe you will, Hayes replied. In fact, I am so confident in your abilities that I am recommending you for advanced tactical training at the Navy's elite flight school. If you continue to perform at this level, you could be flying the most sophisticated aircraft in our fleet within 2 years. The crowd began to disperse as Admiral Hayes and her staff prepared to continue their tour of the base. But before leaving, she made one final stop at the group of mechanics who had been so vocal in their skepticism. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that commanded immediate attention. I understand that you have expressed doubts about Petty Officer Martinez's abilities. I want you to know that your assessment was completely incorrect. Frank Morrison shifted uncomfortably under the Admiral's gaze. Ma'am, we were just concerned about safety and standards. No, Hayes interrupted firmly. You were exhibiting the same kind of thinking that has held back military aviation for decades. The belief that only certain types of people can excel in this field. She paused, letting her words sink in. Petty Officer Martinez has just proven that your assumptions were not only wrong but potentially harmful to the Navy's mission. Tony Ricci attempted to speak up. Admiral, we have always supported qualified candidates. Have you? Hayes asked pointedly. From what I understand, you have spent months undermining her confidence and spreading false rumors about her performance. That is not support. That is sabotage. The mechanics stood in uncomfortable silence as the Admiral continued her assessment. Let me be clear about something, Hayes said. The Navy needs the best pilots we can find, regardless of their background or gender. When you try to discourage someone like Petty Officer Martinez based on prejudice rather than performance, you are hurting our entire organization. Jimmy Walsh, the youngest of the group, looked genuinely ashamed. "We did not mean any harm, ma'am. Intent does not matter," Hayes replied. "Results do. And the result of your behavior was nearly losing an exceptional pilot candidate." She looked at each of them in turn. "I suggest you reconsider how you evaluate your colleagues in the future." As the Admiral and her entourage left the hangar, the atmosphere among the remaining personnel was subdued. The mechanics who had been so confident in their predictions stood together awkwardly, avoiding eye contact with Sarah and the others who had witnessed their public correction. Commander Jackson approached Sarah with paperwork in his hand. "Congratulations, Martinez. Your training schedule has just been accelerated significantly. You will be starting advanced flight training next week." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, still processing everything that had happened. "I appreciate the opportunity you and Instructor Stevens have given me." Stevens walked over, his usual stern demeanor replaced by genuine warmth. "You earned this opportunity yourself, Martinez. What you demonstrated today was not luck or a one-time performance. It was the result of dedication and natural ability." As the crowd continued to thin out, Frank Morrison approached Sarah hesitantly. His usual confidence was nowhere to be seen, replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. We were wrong about you. Completely wrong." Sarah looked at him for a moment before responding. "I appreciate that, Frank. But I hope you will remember this the next time someone who does not fit your expectations wants to try something new." "I will," he replied. "We all will." Tony Ricci and Jimmy Walsh joined Frank, both looking equally uncomfortable, but determined to make amends. "We were out of line," Tony said. "Your flying today was incredible. We should have supported you instead of trying to tear you down." "Everyone makes mistakes," Sarah replied graciously. "What matters is learning from them." As the sun began to set over the naval base, Sarah stood alone beside the aircraft that had carried her to this life-changing moment. The F-18 Super Hornet gleamed in the golden light. No longer just a machine she repaired, but a platform for her dreams and ambitions. 6 months ago, she had been just another mechanic, talented but limited by the expectations of those around her. Today, she was a pilot with a direct path to flying the most advanced aircraft in the Navy's fleet. The transformation had not been easy, requiring her to overcome not just technical challenges, but also the skepticism and hostility of her peers. But as she reflected on the day's events, Sarah realized that the most important victory had not been proving her critics wrong. It had been proving to herself that she belonged in the sky, that her dreams were not foolish fantasies but achievable goals that required only determination and hard work. The mockery of the mechanics had stung, but it had also motivated her to work harder and perform better than anyone expected. Their doubt had become her fuel. Their skepticism, her inspiration to excel beyond even her own expectations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, advanced training that would test her abilities in ways she had never experienced. But tonight, as she walked across the tarmac toward her quarters, Sarah Martinez knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She was a pilot, and no amount of prejudice or skepticism could change that fact. The mechanic who had been mocked for her aviation dreams was gone, replaced by a confident aviator ready to serve her country from the cockpit of a fighter jet. It had been a long journey from the maintenance bay to the pilot's seat, but every step had been worth it for this moment of triumph and the promising future that lay ahead.